Okay, today, this is the handout that we looked over last time. I'm just going to go up to the top. We talked about a lot of different definitions. This is one of those chapters where I would spend a little bit of time going over the glossary to make sure that you are familiar with all of these different types of costs. We are working on utilizing relevant costs, relevant revenues, and relevant costs. Last time we were here, we took a look at some specific decisions, whether to accept a special order, whether to make or buy a part, whether to scrap or rework, whether to sell as is or process further. Today, now, we're going to talk about two major things. We're going to talk about sales mix considerations and eliminating a segment. So these are our two goals today, are to go through the sales mix strategies and eliminating a segment strategy. Any questions on where we've been or where we're headed? Okay, then here is our agenda. We've already recapped the various decisions. Today we're going to work on some more in-depth problems. There is a little section about keeping and repairing or replacing equipment. I don't think any of our exercises deal with that today. Our main focus is going to be on sales mix. And here's what that means. If a company sells more than one product, sometimes, let's say we sell 5 products, sometimes there are constraints built in. And when there's constraints built in, that means that they're either external, which means we can only sell so many units to a customer, right? If our customers are only willing to buy so many units, that's an external constraint. We wouldn't want to produce more than that unless we have other customers out there in mind. That's an example of external, outside of our company. Also, external constraints can be raw materials. You've probably been reading about all these cell phone companies that are looking for a specific natural mineral that helps make their cell phone. There's an external constraint there because there's scarcity right now in some of these resources that people are looking for. So we have to target our sales strategy to meet both of those external constraints. And then we have to deal with internal constraints. What's an example of that? We only have a machine that can run so many hours a day, right? We can't make unlimited product with one machine. That would be an example of an internal constraint. So we need to consider both of these, and our goal here is to optimize the profit. So when we live in a capitalistic society, which is what we live in, and we only can make so many units, we try to maximize the profit on that. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. I also mentioned segment elimination. We're going to talk about that as well. So let me go to the handout for the chapter, and I wanted to scroll down today, and the second half of this handout is going to deal with sales mix. So in this little short paragraph, we'll read it together first, but I'm going to go through step by step how to do it toward the bottom. So it says we want to allocate the resources that the company has to the most profitable units first, which makes sense. And then any leftover capacity, we'll do the less profitable units, and we'll keep producing until our resources are used up. How are we going to do that? Okay, well, that's where this more on sales mix comes in. So here's the steps I'm going to follow today. It will be a little bit more challenging, I think, than the first day of lecture. And here's what we're going to do. We already know how to do this first step. First thing we're going to do is calculate the contribution margin per unit. So just to kind of refresh your memory, what that means is it's the sales price less the variable cost. That gave us the contribution margin. That's a concept that we learned way back in chapter 18. We said that that contribution margin was going to drive a lot of our future remaining chapters, because managerial accounting is all about projections, and that contribution margin has come into play in a lot of different things that we've done, and it's also going to come back today. But since there's some type of a scarce resource, we want to convert that contribution margin per unit into a contribution margin per whatever the scarcity is. If the scarcity is a machine, we want to divide it by machine hours. If the scarcity is a direct material, then we want to divide it by the direct material per pound. So whatever it is that we don't have enough of, whatever it is that is scarce in our environment, we want to convert that contribution margin per unit that we already know how to do into a contribution margin per whatever the scarce resource is. I'm going to show you how to do that. Once we do that, we're going to take the highest contribution margin per whatever the scarce resource is, and we're going to maximize out on that. In other words, we're going to, if we were making three things, here's the step. Number one, calculate the contribution margin per unit. We know how to do that. Here's the new step. Step two, turn it into a contribution margin per whatever the scarce resource is. We're going to do a problem where a machine will only work so many hours. So in that case, it would be turn it into a contribution margin per machine hour. I'm going to show you how to do that. And then if we have three products, we would start producing the one that creates the highest profit. And then after we were done with that one, we'd go to the next product, which has the second highest contribution margin per machine hour. And we would go to number three. In other words, if we have scarce resources, we're going to max out as many as possible of the highest contribution margin, and then we'll systematically go down the line. As always, we've been mentioning these non-financial issues. Don't be so caught up in this bean counters box where all you're looking at is the bottom line. And I have not been shy about sharing my mistakes that I've made in my business by trying to get things made very cheaply without considering, things like the quality issues. And so always be thinking about these non-financial factors. So as always, for me, I think it's easier to just jump in and try these and kind of lecture as we go. Any questions on where we're headed? Okay, so let's jump into our Excel problems. Now, I did send you guys an email this morning that I adjusted the template for today. So some of you download these as we go. That means you wake up, come to class, and you download the Excel file. If you're one of those people that did all the files on day one, you just wanted to take care of downloading all of them on day one, I did revise the file for today. You'll see it in the announcement. In fact, I think I may have left that announcement open. Let me go check. Yes. So if you downloaded all the files at day one, you may want to go download this file really quickly that I sent you this morning. If you haven't done that, then you'll be missing a little spreadsheet that I'm going to be using today. Also, the modules link is revised. I did revise it this morning. So if you just walked into the class today to download your files, you're good. The only people I'm talking to are the ones that downloaded all the files earlier. You may want to go into the announcements and go download that revised file today. So that's what I'm looking at, is the revised file. And again, I think it's just best that we jump in and we try one of these and we can kind of lecture as we go. So any questions before we do that? Let me come in and check the chat room. I don't see Julie in here. Kind of worried about Julie, to be honest with you. Let me check the chat room. Okay, I think we're good. So I'll share my screen again. All right, let's read. Colt Company owns a machine that can produce 2 products. Production time for product TLX is 2 units per hour. Okay, when they tell you that, what we're after is what is the machine hours per unit. If you can do 2 an hour, that means that 1 unit, 1 divided by 2, takes you 0.5 hours. Okay, so keep that in mind. If we're making 2 units per hour, the machine hour per unit on that is 0.5. How do you get it? You just put 1 over however many units per hour they do. And this one, the next one, their second product is 5 units per hour. So if I take 1 over 5, this one takes 0.20 machine units per hour. Okay, so again, step one, this is just like basic math. Figure out how much the machine time per unit is. It's 0.5 machine hours needed for that one, and it's 0.2 machine hours needed for that second one. So that's just kind of basic math so far. The machine's capacity, so here's our constraint. This machine can only give us output of 2,750 hours per year. So we call that an internal constraint, because that machine, which we own or we lease, can only run 2,750 hours per year. Both products are sold to a single customer who has agreed to buy all of the company's output up to a maximum. Okay, so here's an external constraint. We have a customer outside of us that is only willing to buy so many units. Those two things that they just described there, those are external constraints. So we have two things going on. We have an internal constraint where our machine will only run for a certain number of hours. And we have external constraints where we have a customer that's only willing to buy so much of a product. Okay, so we wouldn't want to produce way above that unless we had customers to buy it. They give us selling prices and variable costs. And here's the goal of the second half of this chapter. Determine the most profitable sales mix. This is exactly what we're talking about. The most profitable sales mix. Okay, I'm going to walk you through the steps that we just looked at on our handout. Step one from that handout that we just looked at is calculate the contribution margin per unit. Okay, this is nothing new. We've done this before. So no biggie. I'm going to put my sales price up here, my variable costs, and I'll get my contribution margin. I'm going to do it for two products. TLX is one product and MTV is the other product. And they give us that. So all we're going to do is copy down the information they give us. And step one is just calculate the contribution margin per unit. Nothing new. So let's drop them in. First one is a $15 sales price with the $4.80 variable cost. When we take the difference between those two, we'll have our contribution margin, and I'm going to make this a better label, per unit. When we look at the second product they make, it brings in $950 in revenue. It costs $550 in variable cost to make. And so just like we did on the first one, our contribution margin per unit is $4. Since we have a scarce resource, which is our machine, in this case, it can only crank out 2,750 hours a year. Since we have a scarce resource, we need to turn that contribution margin per unit into a contribution margin per, in this case, machine hour, because that's our scarce resource. Okay, so step two, the new part, is to convert the contribution margin per unit that we got above to a contribution margin per whatever the scarce resource is. In this case, our constraint is machine hours. Okay, how do you do that? I'm going to show you in a second. Any questions on what you see so far? Anybody have any questions? Okay, here's how we do it. We take that contribution margin per unit at the top that we've already calculated. So I'm going to go grab it. It's what we derived in step one. And we divide it by the machine hours per unit. Okay, so I'm going to take both those numbers, and up at the top, we figured out what the machine hours per unit was. That first product up here, we calculated to have 0.5 or half an hour per unit. So I'm going to put 0.5 for your notes. The way that we got that is we took 1 divided by the units per hour. That's how we got that. So if we do 2 units per hour, like they just told us we did, 1 over 2 would be 0.5. On that second item, that was the one where they had 5 units per hour. So up here, we chicken scratched it out. 1 over 5 means it takes them 2/10 of a machine hour per unit. So I'm going to write that down, 0.2. And the way that we came up with that, once again, for your notes, is 1 over the number of units per hour. So in this case, 1 over 5 is how we came up with that. In this first case, it was 1 over 2. And let me put some space in here so you guys can read that. So let's calculate that. What we're calculating right now is the contribution margin per machine hour. In this case, that is the scarce resource. So let's do the calculation. 10.2 divided by 0.5 is $20.40 per machine hour. And when we do the second one, $4 divided by 0.2, that gives us $20 per machine hour. Since this is the scarce resource, this is where our eyes want to be. And so we want to focus on the most profitable one first. That's going to be this one. So I'm going to write for your notes, manufacture as many of this item as possible because it's more profitable based on the scarce resource that we have. After we do as many as we can on this one, any leftover time will be spent making the least profitable unit. Okay, so let me stop. We're running through a series of steps when we have constraints that are placed upon us. In this case, we have 2 constraints. We have an internal constraint, which is our machine that will only crank out for so many hours. And then we have a second external constraint, which is we have a customer that will only buy so many. So we got to be careful not to go over that. If you guys don't have any questions, step 3 then will be to max out on the one that brings in the highest contribution margin per machine hour. That's the green one up here. Now remember, we had a customer that would only buy 4,700 units, right? So we have to remember that constraint. I'm not going to make more than 4,700 if that's all my customers are going to buy. So we have a customer that will only buy 4,700 units. So that's the first thing I'm going to consider. 4,700 units times 0.5 machine hours per unit means that this is going to take up how many hours of my machine? 4,700 times 0.5. This one's going to use up 2,350 machine hours. Okay, so I know that 4,700 units is what I'm going to crank out first. Why only 4,700? Because that's what my customer said was the maximum they were willing to buy. So now what I got to do is figure out how many hours are left to create this second product. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to go back up here to the top. It said that machine will run for 2,750 hours per year. So 2,750 for the second product is the maximum hours machine will go. And I've just used up $23.50 making the first product. That means I have the difference left. Remember, my machine is not unlimited. It can only work 2,750 hours. So once I make the maximum on that first product, I have 400 machine hours left to make the second product, because there's that constraint built in. So how do you figure out how many units can you make with those machine hours left? There's several ways you can solve this. I go back and forth with teaching you which one is easiest. Do you see on this first product, the way we came up with the 4,700 units, this was units here, was it was a threshold. It was an external constraint that our customer put upon us. We can use the same formula looking just like this to back into how many units that will be. And again, there's several ways on how to solve this. I'm trying to look for the easiest one to show you guys. So if I use this exact same formula, I'm looking for units. So I'm going to put a green, let me make another color. Let me make it an orange box here. I want to know how many units can I do. If I multiply by the 0.2 machine hours per unit that one takes to make, and I'm looking to wind up with 400 machine hours, you can kind of use algebra to say x times 0.2 equals 400. The way you would solve that is you would take 400 divided by 0.2. Work backwards, you come up with 2,000 units of the second one. Okay, so it takes a little bit of thought. So let's kind of back up. What the heck did we just do? We have a machine that can only make so many units. We know what the contribution margin per unit is. That is not new. We've done that lots of times. Because we have a scarcity in the machine, how much that machine can crank out, we converted that contribution margin per unit into a contribution margin per machine hour. We chose the highest one. I put the highest one in green. We want to make as many units as we possibly can of the most profitable one. We had another constraint in that our customer was only willing to buy 4,700. So we figured out how much machine hours that would take our machine to max out on that first most profitable unit. And we came up with 4,700 units. And we figured out that would take us 2,350 machine hours. We have this machine over here that will only crank out up to 2,750 hours. Since we spent 2,350 on the first most profitable one, we now have 400 machine hours left. So how many units can we make with the 400 machine hours? I used this formula and kind of worked backwards into getting my second set of products, which is 2,000 units. So our optimal sales item here, let me go write that down. Optimal sales would be 4,700 of this first more profitable one and 2,000 units of this least profitable one. Let's see if that's all they wanted, or they may ask us to turn that into dollars. I'm going to go read the problem one more time. Take any questions you guys have. Let me go see exactly what they want. Determine the company's most profitable sales mix. Okay, we did that. And then they do want us to turn it into dollars. Number 2 says, how much contribution margin will result from that mix? Well, here's our contribution margin per unit. So if I have those units down there that we just calculated, I'm going to multiply by 10, 20, and $4 to turn that into dollars. So here's requirement 1. So let me put that in here. This is what requirement 1 asked us. What's the optimal sales mix? We just figured it out. Number 2 says, turn that into dollars. They want to know what would that be in dollars? Okay, how much contribution margin would that bring in? Well, to figure that out, all we have to do is multiply by the contribution margin per unit, that item that we did in step 1. We just need to turn it into dollars. So we'll multiply by, I have to go back up there and grab it because I can't remember what it was. I'm going to go grab step 1's contribution margin per unit, which was 1020. And I'll multiply this one by its contribution margin per unit, which was 4. So let me document that. This is contribution margin per unit. This is contribution margin per unit. We got that from step 1. I'll turn it into dollars by doing that multiplication. So that one brings in 47,940 in terms of contribution margin. This one brings in 8,000. This is our optimal sales dollars. And if they wanted a total, we could come over here and sum that up. There's the answer to number 2. So here's the answer to number 1. I'll put it in red. And here's the answer to number 2. Here's how much it will bring in. Pretty typical sales mix problem where they threw a couple constraints at us. They threw an internal constraint in that our machine hour doesn't have unlimited life. We can only make so many. That could be due to several things. What the manufacturer tells us we can only use per year. It might be a lease where you're only allowed to make so many. I think of copy machines, right? If you lease a copy machine, it'll only allow you to make so many copies per year. So it could be some type of a constraint like that. Not only did we have that internal constraint where our machine will only work for so long, we had an external constraint in that our customer will only buy so many units. And so we wouldn't want to make above that because they'd sit in a warehouse unsold. So we had to also consider that second constraint, which is our customer was only willing to buy so many units. Questions on that first problem dealing with sales mix?
Professor?
Yes.
How come you didn't multiply it by 15 for the sales price?
15. Oh, good question. Let's go read that. Here's what it wanted. It wanted the contribution margin that results from the sales mix. So Pablo, if they would have said, what's the optimal sales value, then we would have multiplied by the sales price. They asked us on number 2 here, the contribution margin that results from the sales mix. So I probably need to modify this. That's kind of misleading. I'm going to call this the optimal contribution margin dollars because that's what they asked us. You bring up a really good point. If they would have said, what's the optimal sales for that mix, then you're absolutely right. We would have multiplied this by the sales price. So it's the way they asked the question. And I'm glad you brought that up because I needed to revise my answer there so it's not unclear. So I'm glad you asked that question. By the way, Julie just said her internet is not allowing her to Zoom. So I'm going to just email her back or text her back real quick to try restarting her computer. And then I'll get back to class. I know it's so frustrating when these technology issues come up for her and for me. Anything else? Pablo asked some really good questions. Anything else that you guys see in there that you're not sure of, that you need explained again? There's a calculation you don't understand, anything like that. I'm going to keep trying to follow those same steps each and every time. So again, to summarize this process, we're going to go through 3 steps. We're going to calculate the contribution margin per unit. Okay, not new. That goes back to chapter 18. Here's the new part. We're going to convert that into whatever resource is scarce, in this case, machine hours. We're going to focus on the more profitable, and we're going to go right down the line. If we had 5 different things we were producing, we'd max out on the most profitable ones, keeping in mind that any other constraints need to be addressed as we do that. Let me go into the chat room because I think I may have seen something pop up in there. I want to make sure I get any questions answered. Give me 1 second since I don't have Julie today. Tell Julie, oh, I just did, David, restart her router. Okay, let me go type in that because I'm not a technical person. David said restart the router. Thank you, David. I just texted her. Any other questions? And Pablo, if you were able to send those out to Alexis, thank you very much. Alexis, if that didn't happen, I'll get the files to you after class. Anybody else? Okay, let's try another one because we need practice. Here's another sales mix problem. Okay, Childress Company produces 3 products. Each product uses the same type of direct material. And then they tell us how much each one uses. K1 uses 4, S5 uses 3, G9 uses 6. So think about 3 cell phone models maybe. Each one takes a little bit more or less of the same compound. Demand for all products is strong, but only 50,000 pounds of material are available. There's our constraint right there. We don't have unlimited resources. That's something cell phone manufacturers are realizing right now. They only have 50,000 pounds of material that they're going to be allotted. So they give us information about the selling price and the variable cost, orders for which product should be produced and filled first, then second, then third. Okay, we're going to follow the same 3 steps. I'm going to write them down, even though they might seem simple. I want to get us in a routine of doing the same thing every single time so that whatever test question gets thrown at you or whatever managerial problem comes up, you'll be able to go back and say, okay, I need to do these 3 steps. So step 1, calculate the regular old contribution margin per unit. This goes back to chapter 18. It's not new. So we'll do that. We're going to have the sales price less the variable costs, and that will give us the contribution margin per unit. This time we have 3 products, so I'll put that up at the top. We'll copy down the information that the box gives us. So right now I'm just doing a copy from the information above, being careful not to make any transposition errors. And I'm going to calculate the contribution margin per unit. Okay, how do I do that? Subtract. I'm going to carry that across, and then I'll wait for anyone that is writing this down, maybe on pencil and paper. There's step 1. Nothing new here. We've done this before. The new part's coming, but I'm going to wait. That contribution margin, remember, is how much is there to cover fixed costs and generate a profit. The higher the contribution margin per unit, in a normal circumstance, if we didn't have any constraints, we'd be cranking this one out all day long because it has the highest contribution margin. But we have a constraint, and the constraint here is the raw materials. So step 2 is we're going to take that regular old contribution margin per unit, and we're going to convert the contribution margin per unit into a contribution margin per direct material or per raw material. Okay, how do we do that? We take the contribution margin on top. Okay, so that comes from step 1. Let me write down per step 1 or C step 1. So I'm going to go up there and I'm going to grab that because that's going to be my numerator. Oh, bother. And I'm going to divide by, before we divided by machine hours, because that was the scarce resource. Now we're going to divide by direct materials per unit. Okay, because that is the scarcity. So I'm going to go back up there and I'm going to go ask myself how many pounds per unit. And that's what this raw material is sold in, pounds per unit. Let's go back up and find out how much that is. So the first one was 4, 3, and 6. One uses 4 pounds, one uses 3 pounds, one uses 6. 4, 3, 6. Remember, those are pounds per unit. This will give me the contribution margin per pound of direct material, since that's our scarcity. So we're taking a contribution margin per unit that we're used to using, and now we're converting it into whatever resource is scarce. In this case, it's direct materials. Let's go ahead and calculate it. I'm going to let Excel calculate it, but you can do it on your calculator as well. I got $16. And remember what this is, per pound of direct material. So I'm gonna label this so you understand, per pound of direct materials. Step 3, after I wait for you guys to catch up, will be, so what order of production are we going to do first, second, and third, since we have 3 products? So I'm going to stop, give you guys a chance to ask questions. And now the rest of this is easy because they just want to know what order would we produce these in. Okay, well, this is the first. That's the highest. So I'd make as many as I could possibly make of the most profitable one given the scarcity. And then I would jump to the second one, which would bring in $11 per pound. So that would be second. And then lastly, I would do this one third because it brings in the least amount of contribution margin per the scarce resource. Any questions on that one? Okay, I think what I'm going to do is, before we leave the topic of scarce resources, I want to go through a more in-depth problem. I'm going to skip to this last one unless you guys have any questions. Then I'll come back and cover these next 2 tabs. Anybody have any questions? Excuse me. On any numbers you see up there? Okay, then I'm going to go to our last problem. I believe that this may be a 10-point test question in a shortened form. So if you guys can do this problem based on the second half of today, the scarce resource problem, you'll be able to do any test question I throw at you. So this one's going to have several constraints going on. It is probably the toughest problem in this chapter, is my guess, for most people. So we're going to take it step by step and work through it like we've done all the other problems, stopping if you get stuck or you need assistance. And again, if we were in a classroom, you guys would be raising your hand and getting help whenever you need it. If we were in a group environment, I'd be putting you guys in small groups and making you work through this and walking around. But I have found that the groups in an online environment just are not nearly as productive. So let's read through this and then we'll talk about the logic and how we're going to solve it. This one's going to take you through several things. Okay, so we're going to have a machine hour constraint. And we're also going to have a customer constraint, kind of like that first one that we did, but this one's going to go a little bit further. It's going to give us actually 3 options to try out. In business, as soon as you're done explaining, okay, here's what I think will make the most money, managers get creative and they'll say, well, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? This problem's going to be that way. It's going to say, okay, what happens if we use 1 shift of workers? And then another manager comes in and says, well, what if we can double it up? What if we run 2 shifts per day? And then another one's going to come in, well, what if we could entice our customers by giving them some kind of reward? Should we consider doing that? So what we always need to go back to is changing the problem criteria to meet whatever decision it is that we're trying to make. And this all goes back to one PowerPoint slide. And again, I'm not a big PowerPoint user, but this all goes back to this decision-making structure that we started this chapter off with. You want to define the task. What is it that you want to figure out? In that last problem, it was, we want to figure out the maximum sales mix and the order in which we should produce these products. Then you identify alternative actions. Well, we have 3 products. Here's the data. We collected the relevant information. At the end, we told the user, this is what's best to do. We're going to focus on the most profitable per scarce resource in the last problem, or the most profitable per machine hours in the first one, considering any other customer constraints that come in. So this is what this all goes back to. So let me get back to the problem we're working on. And we're going to read it, know that this is going to take some brain power. And so we got to find a way to focus. I know that we're probably 15 weeks or so into the semester. We're all tired. We're ready to end the semester. Pablo and I were just talking about that. And we just got to find a way to persevere. Okay, so let's read it. Some problem is able to produce 2 products with the same machine in its factory. The following information is available. Okay, they did step 1 for us right here. They calculated the contribution margin per unit. So they've taken care of step 1, contribution margin per unit. One takes longer than the other to produce the units. So they did that for us. They said 1 unit takes 0.4 machine hours, and the second product takes longer. It takes a whole hour to produce it. And then we have a maximum number of sales. In other words, we have a customer or customers that are only willing to buy a set amount. So let's keep reading. So far, they've given us a set of facts. The company presently operates the machine for a single 8-hour shift for 22 work days each month. Okay, there's a constraint. It's an internal constraint. So let's stop for a second. If they do a single 8-hour shift for 22 days a month, how many hours is that? So on my calculator, just kind of chicken scratching this out, 8 hours a day times 22 days a month, I got, when I did this, 22 working days, 8 times 22 is 176. So this machine is limited to 176 machine hours. How did I get that? 22 times 8. 8 hours a day times 22 days a month. Okay, so right now they're doing 1 shift. Management is thinking about doing 2 shifts, which would increase the productivity by another 8 hours per day for 22 days per month. In other words, 1 shift is 176 hours. 2 shifts would be double that. 176 times 2. Let's see what that is on our calculators. In that second case, we would run that machine for 352 hours a month. Okay, let me stop. Any questions just on the data? All we've read about so far is the data. All right, number 1. Determine the contribution margin per machine hour. That is the scarce resource. So normally I'm going to get you guys in the habit of calculating these same 3 steps every single time. Even if they gave it to you, I'm still going to do it because I want you to get in a rhythm of doing it the same way every time. So step 1 is to calculate the contribution margin per unit. Okay, I know they did it for us, but I'm going to get us into the habit of doing the same thing every single time. So start from scratch. We need the selling price minus the variable costs to get the contribution margin per unit. So let's put the 2 products up here, R and T, and let's just copy the data that the author gave us. So first one, selling price is 60. The variable cost to make it is 20. Just like the author told us, that first one is bringing in $40 per unit. And that was for R. Move T over. I'm trying to keep everything on the same screen if I can. KT brings in some more. Okay, it brings in 80, but the variable cost on that one is 45. So this one's bringing in 35 per unit. Step 1, calculate the contribution margin per unit. They did it for us, but I'm trying to get you guys in the habit of following the same step every single time. Step 2, turn the contribution margin per unit into contribution margin per machine hour. How do you do that? You take the contribution margin per unit and you divide by the machine hours per unit. So that's what we're looking to do because the machine can only be run for a certain number of hours in a given time period. It looks like they gave us a month time period this time. So contribution margin per unit, I'm going to go grab it from step 1. And the machine hours per unit, they gave it to us. Sometimes they make you calculate it. Other times they'll give it to you. The first one takes 4/10 of a machine hour, and the second one takes 1 whole machine hour. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do my calculation. And when I do my calculation, I'm going to get the contribution per machine hour. Why am I turning it into machine hours? Because that's the scarce resource. So let's go do that. I got a contribution margin per machine hour of 100 on the first one and 35 on the second one. You can see they are very different. This first one is bringing in much more per machine hour than the second one is. So I'm going to focus on making this first one because it's much more profitable. Remember, our machine only, or it should be our staff in this case, our staff can only run that thing for 176 hours. That was our maximum machine hours with 1 shift. So number 1, I think we answered. Number 1 says determine the contribution margin per machine hour. We got number 1 done. Number 2 says, how many units should we produce if it operates with only 1 shift? So they want to know this. How many should you produce? And what will the contribution margin of that sales mix be? Well, this one is a lot higher. We want to make as many of this as we possibly can. So how many units can we make? Well, we had 176 hours available. right? That machine was working 8 hours a day for 22 days a month. There was 176 machine hours with a single shift. So we're going to take that 176 hours and divide by how long it takes to make one unit. It takes 0.40 machine hours per unit. When I do that, I can crank out, let's do it together. I'm going to do it now. I can crank out 440 units. That means I need to make sure that that doesn't blow any constraints that the customer puts on us. So I'm going to compare that to this constraint. That customer is only going to take 550 units. We're good. We're below that. This is below the customer constraint. So we're good. Here's our answer. We're going to make 440 units of the first product, and we're going to make none of the second one because we used up all of our time, all of our machine hours making the most profitable product. So requirement number 2 says 2 things. How many units? We just figured that out. We didn't have any time left to make the other. And they also wanted the contribution margin for that mix. Well, all we got to do is go up to step 1, and we know how many units we're going to make. Here's the contribution margin per unit at the very top, 40 bucks. Each unit brings in 40 bucks. So let me show the calculation. Since I'm doing 440 units and each one brings in, I can't remember, $40. Each one brings in $40 in contribution margin per unit. Go ahead and calculate that. 440 times 40. There's my contribution margin on the first product. Here's my contribution margin on the second, which is easy. I'm not making any. That is the answer for one shift. Okay, so if we're going to use that machine for one shift, the most profitable sales mix is making 440 units of the first one, and we had no machine hours left to do the second one. That turned into dollars. They ask you for the contribution margin for this mix. We multiplied it by the amount they're bringing in per unit. We made nothing of the second. That's the answer to number 2. I'm going to stop. Give you guys a chance to ask questions because they are normal to come up. We're not finished with the problem. We've done one shift so far. Okay. Not hearing any. Then let's go take a look at requirement 3. If the company adds another shift, okay, we figured out that if they did 2 shifts, that was the 352 hours here. If they do a second shift, in other words, they double the machine time to be 352, then how many units of R&T should they produce? How much total incremental income would this mix produce each month? Should they do the second shift? Okay, so requirement number 3 says they're considering 2 shifts. That means if one shift equaled 176 hours, then 2 shifts would equal double that. And we already figured out that that was 352. And for your notes, that's how we got that. Okay, well, just like we did before, we want to make the most units of the first one. That was the most profitable product. So machine hours available, we just figured out for that first product. And let me put those product names up here again, product R and product T. The machine hours available to make the most profitable one is 352 machine hours. When we divide by the machine hours per unit, which on the first one was 0.4, if we spent all of our time making just the first item, how many units could we make? Well, let's do the math. We got 352 machine hours, and each unit takes 0.4 machine hours to make. We could technically crank out 880 units. Okay, but we're not going to do that because there was a customer constraint. If there was no constraints, we'd make 880 of R and 0 of T. But if we look up here, that last line here said we have some customer constraints. That customer is only going to buy 550 units. So given that, I'm not going to make 880. I'm going to make 550 units is the max. Okay, so I have my answer. I'm going to make 550 of those units. Okay, well, how many of those 352 machine hours are those 550 units going to take? That's what we got to figure out how many hours we can work on T. So that's my next goal. I'm going to make 550 units. Even though I would have been happy to make 880, I'm not going to make more than my customer will buy. So this was a customer constraint that we will not go over. I'm going to make 550 units because that's all they're going to buy. Well, how many of T are we going to make then? Well, how many machine hours do we have left? Okay, well, let's figure that out. So just as a quick calculation over here, if we make 550 units and each one takes me 0.4 machine hours to make, then how many hours, go ahead and do that on your calculator, will you have used to make the most profitable product? That would have taken 220 machine hours to do that. So that was to make R. Oops, fix that. To make product R. Okay, well, we're to T now. We know how many we're making of R. Total machine hours, we said for 2 shifts was 352 machine hours. We just used 220 machine hours. I'm going to put C below. We calculated it. What's left for T is the difference. Go ahead and calculate it. 132 hours left for T. Each one takes 1 machine hour per unit. If we find that up here, right here, each one takes 1 hour per unit. When we divide that out, we're going to make 132 units. So in green here is our optimal sales mix. I'm going to stop because there's a lot of stuff going on. It's going to be more brain challenging than probably the first half of the chapter. We're looking at requirement number 3, which said if we do a double shift, what would our optimal production be? Okay, we have it. Now we're going to turn that into the contribution margin that would bring in. So I'm going to turn those green numbers in a minute into contribution margin dollars. I'll write that down. But I want to answer any questions that you guys have. I don't know if Julie was 8. I don't think Julie's in. Okay, let me stop and go look in the chat room and I'll come right back. Okay, David, I did pass that tip along. So we need,
Professor?
yes.
So there's the 132, isn't it? The hours remaining?
Yes, machine hours left. That is machine hours left.
Oh, it's divided by 1. Okay.
Divided by 1 machine hour per unit. So hopefully that makes sense, Pablo. If not, ask away because there's other people that are wondering the same thing. All right, let's turn that green line into contribution margin dollars. What we need is the amount per unit. So going back to step 1, here is the contribution margin per unit, 40 and 35. I'm going to multiply those out by 40 and 35. So 550 times 40 will give us that. And then over here, we'll do the 132 times that contribution margin per unit, which was 35. Let's go do that. I got 22,000 for that one. You guys can check me, especially with Julie not in the room. And 4620. I'm going to total those up. I'm going to add them across. $26,620. There is an additional shift cost to doing that. That has to be taken into consideration because that would be a differential cost. So we got to go back in and find out what that additional shift cost was. I think they told us that someplace. Someplace in here. Yes, right here. This change would require $3,250 in additional fixed costs per month. So that sentence right there. If they do 2 shifts, there's going to be an additional, another word of saying that is an incremental cost of $3,250. So I'm going to subtract that out to find out how much differential income comes in. Okay, let's consider that. You guys check me. I got 29,870. Okay, what was it before? With 1 shift, it was 17,600. With 2 shifts, it's 29,870. So right now, with just those 2 options, we would be better off by doing the other shift. Now, it looks like I added instead of subtracted, so I need to fix that. 23,370 is still better than 17,600. Okay, so I'm going to put a note in your notes reminding you that this is more than what the single shift is putting in. And again, I'm always available to ask questions. So I'm going to put note. This is more than the single shift was bringing in. So if our choice was 1 shift or 2, we would choose 2 shifts And if you wanted to compare them, you could do that. You would take the difference between those two and you would have a dollar value to go with it. Okay, again, sitting around a table with people talking about what's the best strategy. One person says, I say one shift. We calculate that out. Okay, if we do one shift, it's going to be all focused in on the most profitable unit. We think we're going to bring in 17,600. Sitting around that table, somebody else says, okay, what if we do two shifts? Okay, two shifts. Here's what our optimal mix is going to look like. That's going to bring in 26,620. But the incremental cost of doing that, the additional cost of running that machine for a second shift is 3,250. Here's what that's going to bring in. And now you're going to see in the very last one, they're going to throw a third option out there to make us think. Before I add that thing to the mix, though, any questions on the first two? Okay, last one. Requirement 4. Suppose the company determines that it can increase product R's maximum sales, that's a more profitable one, to 675 units by spending an extra amount in marketing efforts. I can tell you so many times this has happened. I've had it happen to me. I've been bribed by a publisher, right? So if you, and this is when I was department chair, if you agree to go with our book, we're going to send you to Hawaii. Okay. In other words, you promise us that you're going to buy 10 classes worth of this accounting book and we'll send you to Hawaii. Marketing efforts, or we'll give you a kickback, or we'll give you a coupon, or we'll send you to Vegas for a week-long convention. Okay, that happens too. So if they can increase their customers' willingness to buy more units by spending an additional amount, would that be a choice? Okay, well, we can figure that out. How are we going to do that? We're going to increase our units that we're going to produce of the most profitable one, number R, from 550, which it is right now. That was the built-in constraint. We'll increase it to 675 units, figure out what our contribution margin will be, and compare that to these first two options. Okay, so number 4 says increase the customer constraint for R to 675 units. Let me change this. This should be an R. Okay, great. Customer constraint will be increased. This is all what if. This is sitting around a table wondering how will different choices affect the company. Okay, well, just like we did here, we're going to take just like we did here, excuse me, we're going to take the 550 units and bump it up now to 675 units. So we'll just pull that one in. 675 units is what we will make on the first product. That was customer imposed. So what are we going to do now? Same thing we did last one. How many hours are left for T? Okay, well, I'm going to come down here again and figure that out. If we make 675 units of R and each one takes us 0.4 machine hours to make, then how many machine hours will we have used up? Let's see, 675 times 0.4 will use 270 machine hours. So now that I know that, I'm ready to figure out how many units I have left. or how much time I should say I have left. Going back up and looking at that double shift, we figured out that the total available machine time was 352 hours. Okay, so 352 is the max hours. We just figured out that 270 of those hours would go to for R. Just figured it out below. So what's left to make this second least profitable product? Go ahead and calculate that. We have 82 hours remaining for T. This is kind of an aside with how we got that. So if T takes 1 hour to make 1 unit, we'll take those 82 machine hours left. We'll divide by 1 machine hour per unit, and that'll leave us with 82 units. Okay, is that going to bring in more money? I don't know. We're going to go figure that out right now. But any questions on how we came up with the units? One was given. The other one took a little bit of work to get there. We had to figure out how many machine hours were left to make those T's. We did that. Now what they're going to want to know is, what's that going to look like dollar-wise? Okay, well, we're going to figure it out right now. We're going to take a look at the contribution margin for the 2 shifts, including extra marketing efforts. That's what we're going to figure out here. We have the data. We just got to pull it all together. Okay, so again, we have R and T. I'll refresh our memory because we can't see it up top. We have R and T, and we know what the units are going to be. We just figured them out. They're in green. So I'm going to grab them. 675 of this one and 82 of this one. We're going to turn that into dollars by multiplying by the contribution margin per unit. That's what we did in step 1. So I'm going to go pull that down. Contribution margin for the first one, I'm just going to go grab it from step 1, was 40. And from step 2, I believe it was 35, but I don't trust my brain, so I'm going to go grab it. I'll do the math. Here's the contribution margin in dollars. I'll let you guys do the math on your calculator or on Excel. I'm going to add that up. I'll make that column bigger so you can see it. So here's my total. Now remember, there were two costs that came into play. There was that additional shift cost that came with that second shift. We still got to consider that when we're comparing these. And then we also had the additional marketing efforts. Okay, so just like we did on the last one, that additional shift cost, and I would have to go back and find it. I remember it was at the end of the sentence. That additional cost $3,250, and the marketing efforts were $4,500. So to compare apples and apples, we got to take those out. Minus $3,250. The marketing efforts were $4,500. I love the marketing efforts. Now that I've been in the real world, so many things run through my head. Those are usually bribes or vacations of some sort. Differential income from 2 shifts and additional marketing. Let me go ahead and sum this up. That's going to bring in 22,020. Compare that to what we just got. When we compare that to what we just got, do you see how that's less than the double shift without the marketing efforts? So I'm just kind of at the very bottom, I'm going to put a recap here to tie this all together. They didn't ask me to do this, but I'm going to do it for our benefit. Here's a recap of the three options. And our three options were a single shift, a single shift, a double shift, and a double shift with marketing. All I'm going to go do is go grab my numbers so that you can compare all three and we can make an educated decision on what would be the best offer. Okay, the single shift, I'm going to go put in equals and go grab that answer. Single shift brought in 17,600. And let me move that over to the wider column here. The double shift with no marketing efforts brought in 23,370. That was our second option. And the double shift with those added marketing efforts brings in 22,120. If you're looking to optimize the most money, you would bring in the double shift without the marketing efforts. That's what you call differential costing, relevant costing, I think your book uses. That was a lot of things thrown at us, but we have the critical thinking skills, and you guys have been working for 3 semesters now, a little bit progressively more difficult as we go on using those critical thinking skills. Let me stop, see if you guys have any questions. Julie said that she appreciated that. She tried resetting the router and now they're on the phone with Spectrum trying to get somebody out. So she obviously is not going to make it in. We've all had that happen. So frustrating, especially if it's on a day of a test or something. All right, then let's see what we have left. Let's go to these last two. And this is the one where I added a spreadsheet in for you guys. I'm hoping you got my email this morning, downloaded the files. Last couple are going to deal with something that won't tax our brain as much. Using relevant cost information to consider eliminating a segment. And what we basically want to do here is we aren't necessarily going to look at GAAP costs to make a decision. Instead, we want to take a look at kind of the same concept we came to in another chapter, the contribution margin to overhead, right? We want to focus on eliminating sections where their sales don't even cover their own direct costs. This chapter refers to them as avoidable expenses. So the author is going to run us through an example of why just using GAAP costs would not be a good idea. So we're going to run through a couple of scenarios here. It says Sharash Company expects its 5 departments to yield the following net income. So think of a Macy's where you walk in and there's the perfume counter and the ladies' clothing counter and the men's clothing and shoes, that kind of thing. So here's 5 departments, it looks like. And just strictly looking at this from a GAAP standpoint, someone may take a look at these 3 negative line items. Here, here, and here. There are 3 departments that seem to be experiencing GAAP net losses. And so he's going to take a look at eliminating those, and let's see what the true effect would be if we eliminated them. Okay, so let's read. It says, recompute and prepare the departmental income statements, back to the last chapter, for the company under each of the following separate scenarios. Okay, number one, management eliminates departments with expected net losses. Okay, again, I see 3 of them. So if we eliminate these 3 yellow departments, because the yellow ones are who we see have a negative amount, if we eliminate these, not all of the expenses are going to go away. If we eliminated the departments that have GAAP net losses, the avoidable expenses would go away and the sales would go away, but these unavoidable expenses would still be left. They would simply be absorbed by other departments. Okay, remember, unavoidable expenses should not be considered in these GAAP costings because there's nothing you can do about it. So if they got rid of those 3 sections, let's see what we would be left with. Okay, I'm actually, and you guys might want to do this with me just to make it easier. I'm going to copy this down and then I'm going to manipulate it. So if you don't know how to copy in Excel, you highlight the area. You can hit the copy command up here. And I'm going to paste this. And what I'm going to go in and do is I'm going to tweak these yellow areas, because if they eliminate those yellow areas, they would have 0 in sales and they would have 0 in the avoidable expenses. Those would be the things directly traceable to those departments. That would happen on the yellow areas. They would have no sales. If they eliminated them, no sales, no direct costs, or what this chapter calls avoidable expenses. But the unavoidable expenses would continue to exist. Here's what I want you to notice. If they got rid of those 3 departments that had GAAP losses, look what happens to their net income. In this case, the loss went actually up, not down. So I want to write that out here. When a segment is eliminated, it brings in 0 sales and 0 avoidable costs, but the unavoidable costs still continue. That's what we just showed. When we did that, our net income actually went up. Loss. That's why we have managerial accounting, because we can't make good decisions simply based on a GAAP income statement. By doing what looked like a good idea to the naked eye, to the untrained eye, we would have actually increased our net loss by getting rid of those departments that showed a negative net income. That was requirement 1. So let me stop. See if we have any questions before we answer the second one. Let me make sure you got that in there. When a segment is eliminated, it brings in 0 sales, 0 avoidable costs because you avoid them, but the unavoidable costs still continue. Those are usually some type of cost allocation, like rent. The rent of that Macy's is not going to go down. It's just going to have to be absorbed by the other departments. Those unavoidable costs aren't going anywhere. They may be reallocated, but they're not going anywhere. They don't change to 0. So any questions before I do the last part of this? Okay, number 2 says then, what if we eliminate departments with sales dollars that are less than avoidable expenses? Okay, so I'm going to copy this down again for another time so we can manipulate it. I'm going to copy this down again. I'm going to try and get rid of the yellow so we can have a fresh set of eyes. And here's what I'm going to read it very carefully again. Here's what they tell us. eliminate departments with sales dollars that are less than avoidable expenses. Okay, eliminate departments with sales that are less than avoidable expenses. Doggone it. Sorry, my other computer just kind of bounced on me. So here we go. Eliminate departments with sales that are less than avoidable sales. Okay, in other words, their sales don't even cover their avoidable expenses. Okay, well, I see one here. I'm going to make these green. Okay, here the sales are greater. Here the sales are greater. Here the sales are greater. Here's another one that they look to eliminate. Okay, well, just like we did before, if you eliminate those, you get rid of the sales and you get rid of the avoidable expenses, but the unavoidable still continue. Look what just happened. When you look at it from that perspective, you got rid of your net losses and actually went profitable. So let me write down what just happened on that. And I'm going to write it down here so I don't have to keep changing screens. When a company is focused on keeping the companies that have a positive contribution to overhead, you'll remember that from another chapter, then the net income was maximized. Okay, so what is the rule we should have learned? We don't want to just take a gap approach and look at the last line and get rid of everything that had a net loss, because when we did that, you saw that that net income actually went up. It didn't go away. So instead, we want to focus on that positive contribution to overhead. Another way of saying that, we want to focus on keeping the divisions that have a positive contribution towards those allocations, towards those unavoidable costs. When we did that, we got rid of only 2 departments and we wound up actually turning a profit. So you can't always just use GAAP data and go that route. If you went that route, we would have only made the situation worse. So that's the approach with segment. In other words, another way of saying that, again, I hate the answer book. They can make things so confusing. When sales cover the avoidable or direct expenses, keep it. That's what we did in that second green picture. Okay, give me 1 second. Trying to answer Julie and some other things. Just give me 1 second. Look at anything you have and ask away if you have questions. Okay. And if not, we have one last one that I don't think will be nearly as troublesome. Okay, I answered her, so hopefully that's gone. Last one. Product pricing using total cost. I'm not quite sure why they put this in this chapter. I think because they have been talking about, should we accept a special order? So on this one, this last one, I think all of you could probably do this before you ever walked in here. They wanted to make sure that students walk out of this chapter by understanding that in the long run, when you set normal product prices, it needs to be enough to cover 100% of the cost that you incur, and in return to generate a profit, because nobody in a capitalistic society wants to just break even. They of course want to make money. So I think this is going to be really easy for you. I just wanted to make sure we get at least one example in case you see a multiple choice question on a test. So this one says, Steve's company makes snowboards. They use the total cost approach. Total cost is exactly what it says. Take 100% of the costs, add your markup in, and calculate your sales price. So its cost for producing 10,000 units follow. They want to make 300,000 in profit. So here's what they want you to come up with in the end. How much should they charge for this product? The other thing I know you guys know from taking your economics classes, you can't just decide to charge a price just because you're covering your costs and generating a profit. You need to take consideration for demand in. You need to take a look at what your competitors are doing, right? I can make the greatest toothbrush in the world, but if I'm charging $500 for a toothbrush, there's no one's going to wait to buy it or stand in line to buy it because all the other toothbrushes out there are much more competitively priced than mine. So again, remember market factors, supply, demand, competition, those things. But in this purely just financial approach, we're going to figure out how much does 1 unit cost. We'll add in that profit that they want, and we'll go from there. So all the costs, this is, I'm going to put in quotes, total cost approach means just that. Include 100% of all the costs. So they give them to us. Direct materials, I'm looking at the box, direct labor. They give us overhead per unit. So that's probably variable overhead. And they give us a selling price per unit. That is on the left. They give us per unit items. So let me copy them down. Remember, in the long run, we're not talking about special pricing like we've done in the rest of this chapter. We're looking at overall long-term selling prices. We got to cover all of our costs. So we also have to cover the fixed overhead, the fixed selling, and the fixed administrative. Okay, well, they give us that, but unfortunately, they give it to us in total. So because these other items are given to us on a per unit basis, we just got to do a little bit more work in figuring out how much 1 unit costs. Okay, well, they just told us that this is for 10,000 units. So here's my calculation. 470,000 that they give us in the box divided by 10,000 units will give us that per unit cost. I'll do it all at once. The selling is 105,000. We'll divide that by 10,000 units. And the fixed administrative is 325,000. We'll divide that by 10,000 units. That's what I'm going to be doing on my calculator or on Excel. And we're going to figure out the fully absorbed cost of 1 unit. Okay, now you might be able to do that on your own. If not, get the calculator out. This is going to be 47. This is going to be 1050. And this is going to be 3250. I'm going to wait in case you guys need to do that on your calculator. I'm going to add it up. The computer can do that a whole lot faster than I can, and it doesn't make transposition errors. So 100% all in with all the costs, fully absorbed. That unit costs $240 to make. So that's per unit. Let me make clear, that's per unit. So the second thing they ask us to do, that was requirement number 1, by the way, compute the total cost per unit. Step number 2, compute the markup percentage on total cost. Okay, so number 2, what's the markup? Well, they said they wanted to make $300,000. So we need to mark up the total cost by $300,000. They refer to that as your markup. So our markup is 300,000. There's other ways to do this also. I'm just using the best way I know how. And so what kind of a markup percentage is that? Well, the total cost would be, whoops, the total cost would be the 240 that we calculated just a second ago times 10,000 units. Let me go ahead and do that. There's the total cost. So what is the markup percentage? You're going to take the markup and divide by the cost. I'm going to show this as a percentage with a decimal place or two. Their markup is 12.5%, which in this country is not going to fly, but it's a book. So we're going to mark our product up by 12.5%. What would be the selling price based on the total cost method? Well, the cost is 240. The markup that we just calculated is going to be 12.5% of that. So let me let the computer do that. 240 times 12.5%. I wrote my calculation down. The total selling price would be the cost plus the markup. We would sell this product. Again, we'd have to look at all other kind of factors. We would sell that product at $270. Enough to cover 100% of the costs plus the markup of $300,000 that they desired. That would be a long-term selling price, a price that we could sell our products at, and that would cover all the costs of producing it, and in addition, bring up this $300,000, which is what they set their target at. Now, again, you guys know from your econ classes, if all the competitors were selling their product at, let's say, 300, we might want to bump that up a little bit, right? We want to sell it for as much as we can get for it. I think I see a question. Let me go in and answer it. So give me 1 minute. I'll bring this back. I'm not taking the screen away. How did you get the markup again? Okay, let me go back and describe that again. How I got the markup was I took the desired profit that was given in the problem. And I think that was David that asked that. That came from right here. The company targets a profit of 300. So that's what goes on the top. So let me write that in. That was given. What goes on the bottom is the total cost. This is a product cost plus approach. So the way I got the total cost was based on what we just did. 1 unit brings in or costs us $240 to make. And we were making, this whole thing was based on 10,000 units. So we put the cost on the bottom. So 240 times 10,000, we got 2.4 million. And then we divided the markup. Let me write that down for you, David. The way we got that was the markup divided by the total cost. So I took that 300,000 and divided by 2,400,000. Double check that on your calculator. When I did that, I got 12.5%. So that's where that percentage came from. And so I used that percentage in the third step to mark up that cost by that 12.5% that we just computed. That 12.5% is used right there. Hopefully that answered. If not, David, ask me again or I'll explain it a different way. I want to make sure that that makes sense to you. Anybody else? You go take a look. Again, I'm not leaving. How did you get the markup? Okay, I think he has that. So I think I answered that. Let me share my screen again in case anyone needs it. That is it. I think the toughest one we did was the one that had the 1 shift, 2 shifts, that one. I'd look that over again. You'll probably see a question that's a little bit shorter than that, but the same type of a concept, giving you several scenarios and having you choose between the best. Out of the last 3 chapters, chapter 24 will be the most difficult out of the last 3. So my hope is that you will jump in, crank out this homework. I did see that I think 4 or 5 of you had already completed the homework even before class. That's awesome. You're amazing. The rest of you finish up chapter 23 this weekend. Give yourself an extra hour or 2 to prep for chapter 24. It is the most difficult. It's also, I will say this, chapter 24 will be a chapter that is heavily used in your finance classes that all of you as business majors will have to take. And it also has a lot of relevance to retirement planning, ways that's going to give you some methods that you can choose to help you make investment decisions for your future. So in that way, I see a lot of relevance to our own personal lives. So I want you to really focus on understanding chapter 24 when you read it. Questions on what's ahead, or questions on anything that we've talked about that you're not quite sure about?